The Australian sun is a relentless witness. It bakes the red earth of the outback until the horizon shimmers with deceptive promises, and it bathes the suburban streets of 1960s Adelaide in a golden glow that once felt like a shield. Back then, Australia was a land of sun-drenched silence, a place where the wide open spaces suggested freedom rather than peril. Families lived with their front doors wide open, trusting the heat to keep the world honest. But beneath this veneer of prosperity and peace, a creeping darkness was taking root. Predators thrived in the vast gaps of a pre-digital society, moving through the silence like ghosts in the tall grass. They were not the famous names we read about today. They were the forgotten ones, the shadows that the public chose to look away from as the country marched toward a modern future. Miller remembers that silence better than anyone. Now in his 70s, his hands tremble slightly as he pours a cup of black coffee, but his mind remains as sharp as a jagged piece of flint. For 40 years, he has been haunted by the faces of those who never came home, specifically the Wildflowers. They were 3 women who vanished during a summer festival, leaving behind nothing but a scent of crushed blossoms and a void that swallowed their families whole. To the public, it became a tragic anecdote of a simpler time. But for Miller, it was the failure that defined his career. He was the one who failed to find them, forced to tell parents the trail had gone cold in the searing scrubland. Before we continue this journey into the shadows, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from, because the stories we are about to uncover reach across the entire continent. His drive for redemption is fueled by a terminal need to balance the scales. Recently, a breakthrough came not from a high-tech lab, but from the smell of old paper and rot. While volunteering in a dusty, neglected police archive destined for the shredder, Miller stumbled upon a file that should not have existed. It was a collection of field notes regarding the bushland stalker, a predator who stalked the Nullarbor Plain during the late 60s. The stalker was a master of the void, using the 1,000-mile stretch of nothingness to hide his tracks. He erased people. The vast interior was his accomplice, where bodies remained undisturbed for a century. The official reports from that era claimed the stalker was a transient, a drifter who had vanished into desert haze. But as Miller sat in that dim archive, reading through the frantic scrawl of a long-dead constable, he realized the investigation had been redirected. Someone had steered the law away from towns toward the sand. Notes mentioned sightings near small communities where everyone knew everyone else. This was not the work of a wandering madman. It was the work of someone who knew the rhythms of the land and the people who lived upon it. Following the trail to an old property near the edge of the goldfields, Miller found himself standing in a house that time had forgotten. The floorboards groaned under his weight, echoing the protests of a past that wanted to stay buried. He was not looking for a body. He was looking for the truth that official records had scrubbed clean. Near the back of the master bedroom, beneath a loose plank obscured by decades of dust, his fingers brushed against leather. He pulled out a small, tattered diary. As he flicked through entries, his blood turned to ice. The handwriting was neat, and names mentioned within were not those of outcasts. The diary suggested that the bushland stalker was a respected member of the community, a man who had shook hands with the very. The names in the diary were more than just ink on yellowed paper. They were a map of a systemic failure that had allowed monsters to thrive in plain sight. During the mid-20th century, these forgotten killers weren't just beneficiaries of simple luck. They were shielded by a pervasive culture of silence and an absolute absence of modern forensic science. Without DNA profiling, digital fingerprinting, or centralized databases, a predator could simply drive across a state border and effectively become a ghost, shedding their skin and starting anew. But it wasn't just technical limitations that hindered justice. There was a pervasive, cruel social stigma attached to many of the victims: the hitchhikers, the runaways, and the young women from the wrong side of the tracks. The police of that era often dismissed these disappearances as lifestyle choices or teenage rebellion, rather than cold-blooded murders. If a girl vanished from a surf beach or a dusty roadside, the files were frequently marked as voluntary departures to keep crime statistics low and the public's anxiety at bay. This institutionalized apathy ensured that the monsters stayed in the shadows, unbothered by the light of investigation. Deep in a coastal town, living behind a dense screen of salt-sprayed tea trees, Sarah exists in a world defined by measured distances and triple-locked doors. She is the living, breathing proof of that historical neglect. In 1974, she was 19 years old, with the Australian wind in her hair and a backpack full of youthful optimism, hitching a ride down the Great Ocean Road. She didn't see a predator. She saw a helpful face in a rusted sedan, who offered a lift to the next town. She survived only by a miracle of physics and a desperate, bone-shattering leap from the moving vehicle into the jagged rocks of the shoreline. For decades, Sarah has lived in a self-imposed exile, her life a quiet testament to the gaze of the predator. She describes this gaze not as a mere look, but as a physical weight, a cold, heavy pressure that stays on the skin long after the eyes have turned away. To her, the Australian landscape isn't a scenic postcard. It's a vast hunting ground where help is always 3 hours too far away, and the sound of a slowing engine is the last thing many ever heard. As Miller pored over the archive, he recalled the bitter internal friction that had defined his early years on the force. There was a silent, toxic war between the old guard, veteran officers who believed in keeping the peace by burying the truth, and the younger detectives who hungered for real justice. The older men often intentionally derailed investigations to protect the department's image or to shield influential local figures who frequented the same social clubs as the suspects. It was this very culture of protecting our own that allowed the coastal crawler to operate with such chilling impunity. This killer was a master of blending into the vibrant surf culture of the 70s, a man who appeared as just another sun-bleached face in the crowds along the Victorian coast. He targeted those looking for a sense of freedom, turning the scenic beauty of the Great Ocean Road into a corridor of unspoken terror. He didn't just kill his victims. He erased them in the churning, violent surf, knowing the ocean would wash away the evidence of his cruelty before the morning tide came. While Miller's unofficial investigation began to trigger whispers in old police bars, Sarah felt a familiar, icy shift in the air. The weight she had carried for 50 years suddenly felt unbearable. Sitting in her dim kitchen, she watched a local news segment about a retired detective digging into forgotten killers. Her breath hitched, and the glass in her hand trembled. It wasn't the mention of Miller that terrified her. It was a figure captured briefly in the background of the footage, a man standing across the street from Miller's house, partially obscured by long shadows. The phone call that finally connected Sarah to Detective Miller was thick with 50 years of silence. When they eventually met in the dim light of a roadside diner, the air was heavy with the shared scent of old grief. Miller saw in Sarah's eyes the same haunted reflection he carried in his own, a mirror of the victims he had failed to save. She told him about the man she saw in the shadows of news footage, a figure that seemed to follow his every move. Miller felt the walls of his retirement closing in. They weren't just chasing ghosts, they were a bridge between past and present. Sarah's testimony provided the human texture the files lacked, while Miller offered the muscle to force open doors that had been rusted shut for decades. As they worked, the investigation shifted into the neon shadows of the 80s. This was a decade of frantic urban expansion, where quiet suburbs were swallowed by concrete. Amidst this boom, the basement weaver emerged. Unlike the outback stalkers, the weaver operated in the heart of the city, using construction sites to dispose of victims. He buried secrets beneath the floorboards of the growing metropolis. While the public marveled at the rising skyline, the weaver wove a tapestry of disappearance that authorities ignored, chalking the missing up to the transience of a modern society. Miller realized the weaver's success wasn't just due to cunning, but to a city too busy looking upward to notice what was entombed beneath its feet. The deeper Miller dug, the more he encountered resistance. It wasn't just the passage of time that eroded evidence. It was an intentional removal of the truth. He discovered that key files regarding the weaver and the coastal crawler had been lost during a departmental reorganization in the late 90s. His former partner, a man he had once trusted with his life, had been responsible for the purge. This partner, now a decorated veteran enjoying a comfortable pension, had systematically destroyed evidence to protect the department's reputation from the embarrassment of unsolved murders. The conflict was no longer a simple hunt for a killer. It was a war against a systemic rot that valued the integrity of the badge over the lives of the innocent. This trail of corruption eventually led Miller back to the scorched earth of the mining districts, where the legend of the ghost of the goldfields whispered through derelict headframes. The ghost was a phantom of the deep earth, a killer who turned forgotten mine shafts into perfect graves. These shafts, dropping hundreds of feet into darkness, were the ultimate accomplices. A body dropped into the abyss was effectively gone, hidden by history and the indifference of the desert. The ghost knew that nobody looks for the missing in a hole that hasn't been touched in a century. He used the geography of the gold rush to hide his private atrocities, ensuring that his victims would remain in the dark forever. The breakthrough came when Miller visited his partner's private storage unit, using a key found inside the diary. In a box marked for disposal, he found a photograph that shattered his remaining faith. It was a Polaroid, dated 1982, taken at a pub near the goldfields. In the frame, his former partner stood with his arm around a weathered man with predatory eyes, a man matching the sketches of the ghost of the goldfields perfectly. They weren't just acquaintances, they were sharing a drink, laughing. The realization was chilling. The protector and the predator had been allies, and the silence that haunted Miller for 40 years was a wall built by the hands that were supposed to uphold justice. This was no longer just about the dead. It was about the legacy of betrayal that allowed a monster to walk free. The photograph was more than evidence. It was a death warrant for the silence they had lived in. As Miller and Sarah drove away from the storage unit, the vast Australian sky seemed to shrink, the horizon pressing in like a closing vice. They were no longer just investigators. They had become the hunted. A dark, nondescript sedan began appearing in Miller's rearview mirror, always 2 turns behind, always keeping a distance that suggested professional surveillance rather than a chance encounter. The weight of the secret they held was becoming a physical burden, a gravity that threatened to pull them under. Sarah, sensing the encroaching danger, made a decision that Miller initially resisted. She needed to return to the site of her 1970s trauma, the jagged cliffs of the Great Ocean Road, where the coastal crawler had nearly ended her life. Standing on the edge of the limestone precipice, the salt spray stinging her eyes, Sarah reclaimed her breath. The wind howled through the gaps in the rock, a sound like 1,000 voices lost to the tide. For 50 years, she had avoided this coast. But now, facing the abyss, she felt a flicker of the power she had surrendered that night. It wasn't just about overcoming fear. It was about understanding the psychological mastery these killers held over their victims and the land itself. These forgotten killers were a different breed from the headline-grabbing monsters of the West. They didn't crave the spotlight or the frantic attention of the media. They were men of the void, predators who thrived on the absolute control that only total silence could provide. They didn't want to be remembered. They wanted to be invisible, finding their twisted legacy in the quiet gaps of a society that was too polite or too compromised to look for the missing. Miller's investigation took a darker turn when he finally cornered his former partner in a secluded coastal cottage. The man he once considered a mentor looked smaller now, his skin like parchment, but his eyes were still hard with the cold pragmatism of the old guard. The confrontation was a grim, whispered exchange of truths. His partner admitted to the purge, revealing that the ghost of the goldfields hadn't just been lucky. He had been a useful tool for local politicians and land developers who needed certain problems to disappear without a trace. The corruption was a web that stretched from the police stations to the highest offices in the state, a systemic rot where human lives were traded for political stability and economic gain. Catching the ghost would have meant pulling a thread that would unravel the careers of the men who built the very state they lived in. It was a pact of silence signed in blood. In the midst of this revelation, Miller's mind drifted to the night watchman, a killer from the 1950s whose files had been among those systematically erased during the departmental purge. The watchman had been a figure of authority, a man in a uniform who used the trust of the post-war era to kidnap children from the very neighborhoods he was sworn to protect. He was the ultimate shadow, a man who functioned as both the guardian and the wolf. Like the others, the Watchman had been protected by the silence of an era that refused to believe such evil could wear a badge or a public title. The danger reached its peak when Miller returned to his home later that night. The front door was ajar. The lock snapped with clinical precision. Inside, the house had been stripped of its history. His research, his notes, and the crucial diary found beneath the floorboards were gone. The thieves hadn't just taken the evidence. They had attempted to erase the investigation itself. But amidst the wreckage of his living room, Miller found something that made his blood run cold. Resting on his pillow was a small, dried wildflower, a trophy from the Wildflower girls' case. The wildflower left on Miller's pillow was a map, a cruel invitation to a final reckoning that the old detective could not ignore. He didn't call the authorities. He knew the frequencies were monitored by the very people who wanted him silenced. Instead, he and Sarah loaded his old sedan and headed north. The journey was a descent into a primeval landscape where the horizon stretched until it threatened to snap under the weight of the sun. Sarah remained a silent anchor in the passenger seat, her eyes reflecting the vast, empty spaces they traversed. She was no longer the terrified girl from the Great Ocean Road. She was a woman hunting the shadow that had darkened her life for 50 years. They tracked the ghost of the goldfields to a remote cattle station. As they arrived, a massive storm front was rolling in, the sky turning a bruised, violent purple. The air was thick with the scent of dry earth and impending rain, a heavy humidity that made every breath feel like a labor. The station consisted of a few rusted corrugated iron shacks. There, sitting on a sagging porch, was the man from the photograph. The ghost was a ruin, his skin like parched leather and his eyes hooded by heavy lids. Yet, as Miller stepped out, he saw the predatory sharpness still flickering in those dark pupils. The killer didn't run. He watched them with the cold detachment of a crocodile waiting in the shallows of a drying creek. "I knew you'd come eventually, Miller," the ghost rasped, his voice a dry wheeze carrying the dust of 1,000 abandoned mine shafts. As the monsoon rain began to hammer against the tin roofs with the force of bullets, the standoff intensified. Miller drew his service weapon, his hand steady despite the tremors of his age. Sarah stood beside him, her presence a living testimony to the ghost's failures. The killer let out a rattling laugh, swallowed by a crack of thunder. He began to speak, not with remorse, but with a terrifying, matter-of-fact pride. He explained that he had never been caught because he was a vital organ in the body of the state. He had cleared the path for the Great Expansion, removing the human obstacles that stood in the way of progress and power. When a politician's indiscretion became a liability, the ghost ensured they vanished into the bottomless darkness of the goldfields. He was a necessary evil, protected by the very men who preached law and order. The tension snapped when a sudden gust of wind tore a loose sheet of iron from the roof. The ghost lunged with a ferocity that defied his years, dragging Miller into the shadows of a nearby shearing shed. The interior was a labyrinth of rusted metal and old oil drums, smelling of lanolin and decay. It was a visceral, desperate struggle in the dark. Sarah followed them in, her silhouette illuminated by lightning flashes that turned the world into monochromatic snapshots. The environment itself fought back. The heat was oppressive, and a large king-brown snake coiled in the corner hissed at the intruders. Sarah found a heavy iron wrench and struck the ghost, subduing the monster. Miller pinned the old man to the dirt floor, his pistol pressed against the killer's forehead. This was the moment of redemption or ruin. The system had failed him, and the dead were crying for blood. The urge to pull the trigger was a physical fire in his veins. But Sarah reached out, her hand gripping Miller's shoulder. "If you kill him like this, the silence wins," she shouted over the roar of the rain. Miller looked into her eyes and saw the light he had almost forgotten. He lowered the weapon, choosing the agonizing path of the law over the easy release of revenge. As they began to bind the ghost's hands, the old man leaned in, his breath foul against Miller's ear. He whispered a name, the name of a young, decorated detective leading the task force. "I'm just the past, Miller," the ghost hissed with a bloody grin. "He's the future, and he's just getting started." The dawn following the storm was a fragile thing, casting long, bruised shadows across the red earth of the Northern Territory. Miller didn't take the ghost to the local authorities. He knew the reach of the men the killer protected was deep. Instead, he and Sarah drove through the cooling desert air until they reached a distant federal outpost, far from the influence of the state's corrupt infrastructure. Seeing the ghost of the Goldfields shackled and led away by young officers unaware of his horrific history felt like the closing of a heavy, rusted tomb. But the work was only beginning. The whisper the ghost had left in Miller's ear, the name of a young, decorated detective, was a seed of rot that Miller refused to let grow in the dark. He returned to Adelaide, not to his home, but to a secure location where he had hidden duplicates of his research. He spent months weaving together the threads of the bushland stalker, the coastal crawler, and the night watchman. He wrote a testament for the silenced. When he finally published The Sun-Drenched Silence, it was a devastating indictment of a system that had traded the lives of the vulnerable for political stability. The revelations shook the country. His former partner found himself facing a grand jury, his legacy of protecting the department finally collapsing into a heap of public disgrace and legal ruin. The impact on the public consciousness was profound. The Wildflower girls were no longer just tragic, grainy headlines from a forgotten decade. A stone memorial was erected in the hills near Adelaide, where the names of the stolen were finally spoken aloud by families who had waited 40 years for acknowledgement. The stigma surrounding victims of the coastal crawler and the basement weaver dissolved, replaced by collective grief and demands for systemic accountability. Miller had promised redemption. While he couldn't bring the dead back, he gave them back their dignity and a permanent place in the nation's history. Sarah found her own version of justice on the southern coast. Standing on the limestone cliffs by the Great Ocean Road, the salt spray misting her face, she felt the weight of decades lift. For 50 years, the horizon had been the boundary of her cage. Now, watching the turquoise waves crash against the 12 apostles, she no longer scanned the crowds for a predator's gaze or flinched at the sound of a car slowing on a gravel shoulder. The coastal crawler was a memory, a monster defeated by her courage. She was a survivor who had finally stepped out of the shadows into the light. Miller knew that the truth required constant tending. He kept the name the ghost had whispered, locked in a safe, a final objective for a man who refused to truly retire. He understood now that silence was a serial killer's greatest ally, a vacuum that evil rushed to fill. The forgotten killers had thrived in Australia's vast distances and social indifference. They had operated in the gaps between towns and behind the shields of official authority. By giving those crimes a voice, Miller had ensured that the gaps were closing. As the sun set, painting the outback in shades of burnt orange and deep violet, the landscape remained beautiful. The red sand, shifted by the restless wind, covered and uncovered the secrets of the earth in a rhythmic, eternal cycle. Somewhere out there, beneath the roots of a ghost gum or at the bottom of a dry well, other secrets surely remained buried. A nation's history is written in what it remembers, but its soul is found in what it tries to forget. The wind whispered through the spinifex, carrying the echoes of 1,000 untold stories. While one monster was caged, the land would always keep its mysteries hidden just beneath the red surface, waiting for the next person brave enough to dig for the truth that had been long denied to those lost in the silence.